Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and we start out in the New York Toretsk direction, where the city of New York has now started being under attack by Russian soldiers. The very southern outskirts of it, the Russians have captured a few fortified positions to the south, in which fighting continues heavily in this area as Russians attempt to push throughout the area, gain a foothold, consolidate their gains, and push forward in a northern direction. Similar to the east of Toretsk, the Russians they managed to capture the village of Shumy and gain a foothold within Pivnishne. The Russians are now also attacking the direction of New York. The interesting part about this area is that it is a very long part of the city which just extends in a downward direction, while in the north it goes both in the western and eastern direction, where there are some apartment complex areas in the west and there's an industrial area in the north. This is a heavily fortified city and it is very defensible. This means it is a very difficult operation for the Russians to actually gain a foothold and push onwards in a northern direction, where the Russian attempt would be to gain this foothold, which they have succeeded with, and then consolidate these gains to then operate further into the city. The Ukrainian positions here are very narrow, as we see the city itself is only directly straight down. There's no girth to it, which means that the Ukrainians would not be able to defend on a wider front. Therefore, the Russians are spearheading directly towards it to capture these fortified positions near the forest lines and consolidate their gains to operate further in a northern direction. This also means that the Ukrainians don't need that much artillery to hit the Russian positions unless the Russians expand their front line in a eastern and western direction towards the Ukrainian fortified positions to expand the front line and expand the area in which they are attacking from, which would require the Ukrainians to fire more artillery and FPV drones on their positions. In the next section of the front line here in the direction of Rozdolivka, the Russians have managed to capture the majority of the village, leaving only the northern outskirts remaining under Ukrainian control along the Sukha Plotva river. This means that the Ukrainians will likely withdraw from the final parts of Rozdolivka beyond the river line, north towards Pereshene or west towards Rifka, where they'll pick up their next defensive positions. The Russians already have a foothold across the river line by Sekoiv and Seti, which means that they will either push onwards in a western direction towards Vasyukivka or northern direction towards Fedorivka as the next step following the capture of Rozdolivka. They also have a foothold across in the northern parts, which will allow the Russians to push in the direction of Pereshne. So this means that the Russians will not slow down after the capture of Rozdolivka, but will instead continue their offensive operations in the area. According to Deep State Map, there's also positional fighting along the southern parts of Vyimka as the Russians attempt to push further in a northern direction towards the village. So we see positional fighting continues here in the north of Soledar and in the Toretsk direction, and we do not see any reports of developments in other sections of the front line. One of the main reasons for that is a lot of these developments either come delayed or after a multiple day operation where the Russians or the Ukrainians manage to advance in that part, and then they report on it as a complete report rather than slowly advancing bit by bit every day and then reporting every single daily gain. Similarly, here in the Terny direction, we see a large Ukrainian recapture of significant parts east of Terny. This is 5 square kilometers. However, it is reported by Deep State Map that this is a series of operations that happened at the end of April, where 4 Ukrainian brigades worked together to recapture these parts, including one Azov unit. This shows that the Ukrainians put significant efforts into recapturing this part, yet they did not talk about it until 2 months later, now in late June, where we got this report just yesterday about the Ukrainian recapture of this part of the front line. What this shows, in my opinion, is that the Ukrainian commander in this section of the front line near Liman, similar to the Siversk commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, is not one who is obsessed with PR developments, but instead focuses on results, as they do not focus on gaining some sort of stupid victory like Krinky, where they concentrate a lot of forces, make a push, and to capture some territory that is completely useless, who then post about it on social media. Instead, this is a commander who worked on defending the positions and has holds the eastern bank of the Serbets river line for over a year by now, Yet the Russians have been unable to push through, and he waits 2 months before posting about the details of this success on social media. This shows that this is a commander who knows what he's doing, and if the Ukrainians had a lot more of these type of commanders, then they would be performing much better. It is clear based on what happens on the front line that depending on who is the commander of the forces, rather than which forces operate in the different sections of the front line, shows the amount of success either side is having. It's like the Russians pushing through the Avdiivka section of the front line, which is heavily fortified with just regular soldiers, yet have been able to advance a significant portion and the majority of the way between Avdiivka and the highway between Pokrovsk here to the west and Konstantinivka to the north. Yet they do not have any different soldiers than in the Volodar section of the front line or the Kupyansk section of the front line, where the Russians have been unable to push through. Similarly, the Ukrainians have been unable to hold the defensive positions near Avdiivka, yet they've been able to do so in the northern direction and in the Liman section and Siversk section of the front line. A fact that is widely known is that both Ukraine and Russia have suffered a lot from corruption. And this corruption is not just in the stealing of funds or the general idea about money, but it also about putting people who are unqualified for a position in a position of power due to connections or other reasons. And this usually is what happens here in this war. We have seen multiple cases of such on both the Russian and Ukrainian side, where completely incompetent commanders have had high positions with a lot of power and control over a lot of soldiers, and they ended up completely demolishing those units and not gaining any results. And therefore we see as the Russians and the Ukrainians continue to fire some of these commanders who are extremely corrupt, they improve on the front line, and if there was no corruption on either the Russian or Ukrainian side, they would probably have won the war by now, regardless of whether it is the Ukrainian or Russian side. That is how rampant corruption is in this war. In the Kupyansk direction, we see right here that the Ukrainians have been able to recapture parts of this forest line, just about the area where the Russians have been pushing against the Ukrainian positions. And we see this with this dual-gated footage here of this Ukrainian push. That is the current position here in the Kupyansk section of the front line. And in the Vovchansk direction, we see this footage here of a Ukrainian crossing across the river line right south of the aggregate plant. The Ukrainian soldiers are here attempting to cross over to the northern part of the river line, but are being hit by Russian mortar and artillery strikes. A Russian drone is flying to give reconnaissance in real time for the artillery crew of the Russians, after which they are heavily bombarded by artillery. So this is exactly what I talk about when I talk about this being a Russian trap. The Ukrainians have to cross over a river where there's 24/7 Russian reconnaissance, and they are constantly hit by artillery, and even if they manage to get through across the northern bank of the river line, they then end up in positions that are heavily bombarded by FAB bombs, TOS strikes, and so on. But despite that, the Ukrainians simply have so many troops in advantage compared to the Russians in this section of the front line, which still allows them to push through the Russian defenses and recapture large parts of the Vovchansk direction. This is largely due to the Russians failing to consolidate their gains when they initially captured major parts of it and left major parts undefended, and this is due to the lack of manpower in the Russian push, forcing them to concentrate their forces in smaller positions like in the aggregate plant, where a significant portion of the Russian troops were concentrated to push through the Ukrainian defenses, and this allowed the Ukrainians to break through the Russian defenses, capture the apartment complex area here in the north, and gain a strong foothold in the center, which forced the Russians to relocate forces from the east, after which the Ukrainians took advantage of that to push here in the east. And that is the advantage of having such a large manpower advantage. It allows the Ukrainians to focus their forces all across the front, while the Russians have to relocate their forces in these different positions. But this also shows exactly the importance of what the Russians are doing here in the east, where they have a lot of manpower all across the front, but the Ukrainians are forced to spread their forces out thin because the Russians launched these operations in the north. And in that regard, it is reported by Deep State Map that the Russians have crossed the border here in the northwestern parts of the Kharkiv region and started attacking this village here that is named Stotnitsky Kusachuk. This is similar to the Sumy incursion in the sense that there's hardly any information on it, and therefore I will not be talking about how the Russians are expanding the front line or any sort of thing in that regard until there's more information and the situation has cleared up. But it is reported that the Russians have crossed the border and started attacking that village, which could indicate that the Russians are expanding their front line in that direction. It was also reported by Ukrainian sources that the Russian concentration of troops here was near the Sumy region in the southeastern parts or in the Kharkiv region in the northwestern parts. So this is where the Russian forces were concentrated, meaning that this could be, but again, there's no clear information about it, so I'm waiting until further clarification. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.